Okay. Well, again, welcome to everybody to the last lecture of this mini course that I've been enjoying quite a bit. Also, thanks to your questions and comments. I hope the same is true for you. As promised, in this last lecture, we will be dealing with a topic that is considerably less abstract and, if you want, philosophical than the three topics that we have covered so far. And it's a classical topic for anyone who is interested in human rights, because as I'm sure you know, one of the main challenges to human rights has always been this charge of being tentatively universal, but ultimately Western-centered and capable of finding what one of the author we will be studying today calls cultural legitimacy only in the Western world. Whereas since the very beginning there has been a resistance in a non-Western context, especially in few Islamic countries and other Asian countries, against the values that underpin the Universal Declaration first and the international treaties then later on. So let me just give you this example to show the problems of cultural legitimacy and the problem of question the universality of human rights right after the publication of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not right after, during actually the moment in which the United Nations issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Saudi Arabia representative made an official statement saying that we didn't think that the whole point of the commission that led to this document was to affirm the superiority of one culture or of one part of the world over another. If we had to sign this Universal Declaration, we would be implicitly recognizing that our values, that our culture is inferior to the ones that seem to have generated this list of rights, and therefore we refuse to sign. So that was the first official point of friction between human rights and Islam, or at least, as we will see, Islam under a certain interpretation, Islam as practiced in specific countries, and so on and so forth. So what we will be doing today is to see the extent in which there is a problem of limited universality of human rights in two major contexts. On the one hand, the Islamic world, or the Muslim world, and the other challenge, as it's sometimes called, the challenge coming from the so-called Asian values, which, as we will see in the second part of the lecture, basically turn around the idea that the community has priority over the individual. Basically, it's more important than the individual. And since human rights, as pretty much all rights, have a strong individualistic tendency, it seems to be leading to another conflict, basically. Okay, let's start though with a friend of mine, who's a friend of Alessandro, called the elephant in the room, that is Islam. Because of course when we talk about lack of cultural legitimacy, potential conflicts around the world between certain values that underpin human rights and other cultures, what comes to mind immediately is the Muslim world. So I wanted to draw your attention to this paper that is pretty old, the 1990 But I think it's still one of the best pieces of scholarship on this problem of the relation between human rights and Islam, in particular the legal face of Islam, if you want, that is Sharia. An-Nahim is, as usual, one of these figures that has a double identity. He's a Sudanese, South Sudanese to be precise, who studied in the West. I think he studied in the UK. He's now teaching in the United States. He must be quite old, but he is incidentally part of this group of scholars that have put together to try to come up with a unified definition of human dignity, cross-cultural definition of human dignity. So I really look forward to working with him because I like him very much. And in this article, which is kind of a summary of the book that he also published at the beginning of the 90s on the relation between Islam and human rights, he proposes a line of interpretation of this potential conflict that in very crude and reduced to bare essential terms goes as follows. There is, as it is practiced today, a strict incompatibility between Sharia and human rights. So he's not arguing that there is no problem, basically. But at the same time, and that's I think is the most interesting part of his contribution, there is a way to reinterpret Sharia that is still faithful to the Muslim conscience, so to speak, to the Muslim sensitivity, which can make Sharia and human rights less in conflict with one another. This is an approach that starts from the premise that we will never be able to buy consensus in the Islamic world unless we show that human rights are not in conflict with the sacred text, which is the Quran and the Sunnah mainly. But we cannot hope to reach this kind of cultural consensus unless we show two things. One, that Sharia as it is today is in strict contradiction in many parts with some of the defining features of the human rights cultures. And on the other hand, that there is a way that is not blasphemous, so to speak, and it's actually very much in line with religious sensitivity to reform, because that's what it is. It's not really a question of giving a different interpretation, but really a question of reforming Sharia in such a way that this conflict is at least lessened. Okay. As he puts it, I adopt a constructive approach to the problem of the cultural legitimacy of human rights norms. This approach posits that such problems can be overcome through a process of reinterpreting the fundamental sources of Islamic tradition. The proposed, of course, he is a Muslim. That's one of the interesting things about all this, because he knows what he's talking about and he has a sensitivity as a Muslim. The proposed new interpretation will have to be undertaken in a sensitive, legitimate manner, and time will be required for its acceptance and implementation by the population at large. The availability of such reinterpretation is a vital prelude to the political struggle, which is integral to the whole process. The reformulation I offer in this paper is nothing but a brief presentation of my arguments for a reinterpreted approach which I have explored in more details elsewhere, the book I was mentioning before. Okay, so let's see how this reinterpretation goes. Okay, as you know, or might know, the Quran is the law or the verb, to use a Christian terminology that was given to Muhammad during his life from 609 until his death 633 after Christ. Now, some people think that Muhammad was illiterate, therefore he could not write what God was telling him. I don't think that Muslims are happy with this characterization, but it is true and accepted by Muslims as well that it was not Muhammad himself who wrote down the Quran, but people who were working with him. No, that's accepted knowledge. Of course, the first and most important part of the Muslim sacred text is the Quran itself, but it's not the only one. Because in addition with what Allah told Muhammad, there were also the actions and the statements that Muhammad made during his life that have come to be part of this body of sacred law, so to speak. But there is a further complication, which is that during his life, Muhammad also established the first Islamic state in Medina around 622, which then was taken as the ideal state, the ideal of Islamic state. So there were first 4 caliphs after successor of Muhammad. So after his death was a list of 4 caliphs, and the practices of those 4 caliphs also became part of the Sunnah, so became part of the law, so the kind of interpretation of God's words and translation of God's words into practical legal norms. I mean, because it's one thing to say that, I don't know, that you have to be faithful and then you have to be respectful of other people, but then the translation into legal norms of these very abstract principles takes practice and jurisprudence, of course. And so the practices of these 4 caliphs are also binding and highly authoritative, at least for the 90% of the Muslims. Who are these 90% of the Muslims, in your opinion? Well, what is the largest majority of Muslims, given the big division between Sunnis and Shias? Sunnis. Sunnis are by far the large majority of Muslims. So basically, the ruling of these 4 caliphs are authoritative for the 90% of the Muslim population, Sunni. In contradistinction, the Shia minority insists that only the 4th caliph, Ali, who was the cousin of Muhammad and also the the son-in-law, because he married Fatima, who was the daughter of Muhammad. For the Shia minority, only the practices and rulings of this 4th caliph, Ali, are binding, whereas the other 3 are not legitimate successors of Muhammad. Okay? So, but in any event, the point that matters for us here is that while the Quran was recorded right after the life, or during or right after the life of Muhammad, so there is a kind of reduced space for development or misinterpretation, the Sunnah, especially that part of the Sunnah that had not to do with the actions or statements, verbal statements that Muhammad did, but that has to do with the statements and the actions of the 4 caliphs that came after Muhammad, was recorded at a much slower pace, and it took at least 200 years, incidentally in a period in which in the Muslim world there was a lot of turmoil, because it was, the beginning of the religion itself and also of the transformation of the religion into a political power, basically, with expansion in the Middle East. So it took almost 2 centuries to have a unified text, the Sunnah, which included also these later developments. Now, Sharia, that is again the legal face of the sacred text, is both derived by the Quran and the Sunnah. And of course you see where An-Na'im is getting at. He wants to say that, okay, the Quran is not touchable, basically, but the Sunnah, to the extent in which it was first unified and organized as a body of law, or as a unified text only much later than the Quran, the Sunnah can be legitimately reinterpreted without being blasphemous, without saying, oh no, if there is a conflict between human rights and the Islamic faith, well, just forget about the Islamic faith. Human rights are more important. That's not the suggestion that An-Na'im is giving us. He's saying, if you care about cultural legitimacy, you have to find a way to show Muslims that Sharia depends on a piece of Islamic scripture that can legitimately be reformed because it was itself made by men, if you want, and incidentally by men who were attached to a certain society, to a certain tradition, and to a world that bear a distant resemblance with the one we inhabit today. So it's perfectly okay to get rid of this way of interpreting the sacred scriptures in order to make it more consonant to our sensibilities, to our world, and so on and so forth. So, as he puts it, Sharia was constructed by Muslim jurists over a long period of time and did not become a comprehensive legal and ethical system until well into the 3rd century of Islam, so 9th century after Christ. The jurists who founded the main schools of Islamic jurisprudence that are followed by the vast majority of modern Muslims did their founding work between the middle of the 8th century and the middle of the 9th century, 1 to 200 years after the Prophet's death. In fact, the techniques and methods for the derivation of general principle and specific rules of Sharia, such as ijma, consensus, and qiyas, analogy, were not settled until the time of Shafi'i, who died in 1819. So, while, of course, like any juridical text, like any sacred text, the main concern of the Quran was to give religious prescriptions, the Sharia includes the further complication that, as I was saying, is the translation of prescription, if you want to have your soul saved, into prescriptions that become legal prescriptions, which is a different thing. Because when you enter the legal world, you enter the concrete realities of the world you want to rule on, and you're not talking about your conscience only. And again, if you talk about the real world, it depends what historical real world you are talking about, which inserts another element of contingency within Sharia. Okay. Now, one of the things An-Nahim is interested in is to match this analysis with the problem of the resurgence of Sharia in Islamic countries, in the Islamic world at large. I mean, as he puts it, the secularization problem in the Islamic world has had and still has ups and downs, so to speak. There are moments in which certain, at least some Islamic states want to become more secular. Traditionally, Turkey has always been the most secular of the Islamic states from Ataturk on. Now we see that the process is going in the opposite direction with Erdogan. So there is a re-Islamization of Turkey is going on. Saudi Arabia has always been considered the outmost, the most fundamentalist, the most the strictest follower of Sharia in the Islamic world. Indonesia has often been considered the opposite, as the least strict and the most one of the examples of an Islamic state in which Sharia was not implemented in a strict manner. So there are variation within the Islamic world, and there are variation depending on time, with countries that go up and down in this process. Egypt is another excellent example, with Sadat first to try this socialism, this Muslim socialism, an attempt to secularize Egypt, but depending on political circumstances also use Islamic fundamentalism as a political tool to re-establish and reinforce one's own rule. So when a ruler in an Islamic country lacks legitimacy, is not very popular, it's not uncommon that it appeals to Sharia or more Islam in the society in order to strengthen his rule most of the time. I mean, there are few examples of female Muslim leaders, although there is Bhutto in Pakistan, who, despite the fact that Pakistan is one of the most fundamentalist Islamic states, another paradox, was ruled for quite a bit by the daughter of Benamir Bhutto. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because, again, given the approach that An-Nahim is taking, it is important to look also at the sociological and political developments within the Islamic world, because of course when you have this resurgence of Islamic fundamentalism, it becomes more difficult to buy cultural legitimacy for human rights. And he takes his own work as a way also to contrast and oppose this re-Islamization by saying that Sharia should be interpreted once and for all as not something that you can appeal to in order to retransform or take backwards the political structure of your country. Because once Sharia is reinterpreted the way An-Nahim wants, it no longer can serve as such a political tool. Okay, now as I was telling you, one of the features of An-Nahim's approach is that of refusing the idea, common often in other scholars, even competent ones, that as it is today, or as it was, if you want, when An-Nahim was writing this paper, Sharia presents no problem in terms of compatibility with human rights. For example, Ali Wafi is an example of these scholars who thinks that the most important human rights can be classified into 5 principal rights relating to 5 kinds of liberty: religious liberty, liberty of opinion and expression, or expression, liberty of work, liberty of instruction and culture, and civic liberty. And he go on, this other guy, Wafi, citing general Islamic sources in support of what? Of each of these 5 liberties that he finds in human rights, which of course are there, because one of the things one more often hears is that the Islamic State has always been capable of accommodating the existence of other religions. So it's not the case that if you were a Christian, even in the golden age of the Muslim world, or if you were a Jew, you were expelled, you were discriminated, but up to a point, with protection of certain rights that you have, as opposed to, for example, what happened in Spain, where the Jews were expelled in the 15th century. So sometimes you hear this story, you talk about religious tolerance, you Christians, you talk about religious tolerance, but we have always been very capable of accommodating the presence of different religions. We never expelled anybody from our world. So what are you preaching? And that's, I don't know whether this is exactly Wafi way of going, but this idea of highlighting liberties that are certainly there in the or even in the traditional interpretation of Muslim sacred scriptures, but of course, and I agree with Al-Nahim here, this way of proceeding is extremely misleading. As he puts it, this is hardly an adequate description of civic liberty as a human right, even in the most formal and minimal sense. So, civil liberty, at least as we understand them, and also as the human rights documents understand them, is not limited to an ability to have private property, or an ability to conclude contracts. It's not just private law, right? It's also, the ability to associate, the ability to protest against the government, the ability to initiate a political party, and so on and so forth. And if you start with this definition of civic liberties, then the alleged compatibility with Sharia as it is traditionally understood comes back. Not to mention, of course, that Wafi only highlights the good parts of the Quran and the Sunnah with no mentioning of other parts that are more straightforwardly in contradiction. For he fails to mention, as he puts it, the ways in which jurists of Sharia interpreted these sources and the manner in which Muslim states applied those interpretations through the ages. So the claim that Sharia is fully consistent with and has always protected human rights is problematic both as a theoretical and as a practical matter. As a theoretical matter, the concept of human rights as rights to which every human being is entitled by virtue of being human was unknown to Islamic jurisprudence or social philosophy until the last few decades, and does not exist in Sharia. Many rights are given under Sharias in accordance with a strict classification based on faith, gender, and are not given to human beings as such. As a practical matter, fundamental inconsistency exists between Sharia as practiced in Muslim countries and current standards of human rights. For example, many aspects of Sharia discriminate against women, and that's the last point we will be talking about, discriminate against women and violate their fundamental human rights. So there is a theoretical inconsistency. If you just make a textual analysis of Sharia, you find there inconsistencies with human rights. There is an additional inconsistency given the practices of jurists and political leaders that have translated Sharia into their own domestic law. Examples. So some examples of this inconsistency. One, although slavery was formally abolished in Muslim countries through secular law, the institution itself remained lawful under Sharias to the present day. It is true that Islam originally discouraged slavery by restricting the legitimate sources of slaves and encouraging their emancipation, but it did not directly prohibit slavery, and the institution of slavery has never been abolished under Sharia. In fact, treaties on Sharia discuss at length contractual and other arrangements relating to slaves. In my view, the original intention of Islam was to eliminate slavery in due course, but that intention has never been realized through Sharia. So first example, slavery. I mean, he says, yeah, I think that what Muhammad wanted was to get rid of slavery in due course, but there is no straightforward prohibition within Sharia against slavery. Second example, perhaps more clear, is Sharia's law of apostasy. You know what apostasy is, when you change religion, when you reject the religion that you have been practicing up to a certain point. And it's not but I guess it includes if you say, well, I no longer believe in God. But it's most of the case when you change in favor of another religion. According to Sharia, a Muslim who repudiates his faith in Islam, whether directly or indirectly, is guilty of a capital offense punishable by death. Maybe. Somebody is not happy with this class. Somebody very powerful is not happy. Okay. I mean, there is no reason to argue to show that capital punishment for apostasy is in contradiction. It's to the extent that one of the least contested of the human rights is the freedom of religion. Now, also the Sharia law on apostasy can be used to restrict other human rights such as freedom of expression. A person may be liable to the death penalty for expressing views held by the authorities to contravene the official view of the tenets of Islam. So you are not sentenced to that if you protest against your government, but if you use arguments in these complaints that you have that the authorities consider as anti-Islamic, then you are risking your life, basically. So if the authorities think that you are making a political agenda which includes anti-Islamic tenets, then your life is in danger. And as he puts it, I'm not talking about fictional possibilities. Far from being an historical practice or a purely theoretical danger, this interpretation of the law of apostasis was applied in Sudan, his country, as recently as 1985, so 5 years before he wrote, when a Sudanese Muslim reformer was executed because the authorities deemed his views to be contrary to Islam. And the other famous example is Salman Rushdie, of course, the author of Satanic Verses, the guy, the UK citizen, I think, but was born in Iran, who wrote this pretty blasphemous book on, on Muhammad, and if I remember correctly, on the temptation of Muhammad, or it was pretty blasphemous. But basically, what the Khomeini did was to issue a sentence to death against a foreign citizen, among other things, to be carried out probably by any Muslim who was concerned with the protection of faith. So this idea of risking your life for the crime of apostasy has been, and I guess it's still, a real threat. third example of conflict between Sharia and human rights, the status of non-Muslims. So notice this the second example he gave shows that even Muslims suffer from inconsistency between human rights and Sharia, because apostasy, of course you don't suffer the same consequences if you move from Christianity to Islam. There are different kinds of apostasy, of course. Okay, so non-Muslims. Well, going back to this idea of the ability to be more tolerant, of the even in the Golden Age, so even in the Middle Age of Islam towards other religions, An-Naim says, wait a minute. It is true that we didn't expel Christians and Jews. It is true that we didn't steal property from Christians and Jews. It is true that there were certain rights that were enjoying, but of course they were B-class citizens compared to Muslim citizens. The Muslims were distinguished by other believers in revealed scripture, so Christians and Jews, and unbelievers. So they were the only full citizens of an Islamic state and enjoying all the rights and freedom granted by Sharia and subject only to the limitation and restrictions imposed on women. So the A-class citizens were male Muslims, the A-class citizens were female Muslims, and the B-class citizens were non-Muslims.
What kind of place they have in mind, like in Spain, Cordoba, like
What country are we talking about?
This tolerance between the Muslims tolerating other religions.
Oh, well, I don't know for sure, but I guess also in the Ottoman Empire it was like that. So any state that would instantiate Sharia would have this kind of organization in layers of the society. Well, of course, Saudi Arabia, from the very beginning, what we call today Saudi Arabia, Northern Africa, the whole world from the Middle Age on, that was dominated by Islam. But yeah, I guess the biggest example is the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so the non-Muslims are entitled to the status of dhimma, a special compact with the Muslim state which guarantees security of persons and property and a degree of communal autonomy to practice their own religion and conduct their private affairs in accordance with their customs and laws. So now that I think see where the idea of a decent people comes from. When Rawls think of decent people, he has the Muslim state in his head, and he adds, not accidentally, to physical integrity and private property also the freedom to protest against the government. So the dhimma had a little bit less rights than B citizens in a decent states, but most of them. Okay, that's just a parenthesis to show, because it came to my mind, it reinforced my idea that decent peoples are pretty much Islamic states. Not, of course, because even Rawls calls this state, this decent state, the Kazakhstan, not Kazakhstan that exists, but Kazakhstan, so a fictional state That sounds pretty much a Muslim state. Okay, the interesting things about dhimmis, that is the non-Muslims within the Islamic states, was that in exchange for these beautiful rights that they were given, so the ability, not, their physical integrity, their wealth protected, and so on, they had to pay the tax to the state. It's called jizya. That was a kind of tax to be present within the Islamic State and protecting according to the rights that I've listed. So, again, this goes back a little bit to what we were talking about. How much discrimination are you ready to concede before you think that there is a strict incompatibility with human rights? As I told you, the political philosophers, the exponents of the political orientation in the philosophy of human rights are quite ready to allow for, a rather big discriminations going on in what you might call the decent people, the decent state. With the consequences that we have seen. So what An-Naim says is that, okay, especially if these rights of dhimmis were restricted to physical integrity and private property, they are incompatible with what Buchanan calls the egalitarianism of human rights. Basically, one of the most important concerns of human rights is precisely to avoid discriminations on the basis, among other things, of religion. Okay, it has to be said that some of the restrictions against non-Muslims have not been enforced in most Muslim countries for some times, but they all remain part of Sharia, and consequent violation of the human rights of non-Muslims recently have occurred in some modern Muslim countries. So not only are these human rights violations committed against those who identify themselves as non-Muslims, such as the Copts of Egypt, the Christian minority in Egypt, but they were also committed against minority Muslim sects which are deemed by the majority to be apostates from Islam, such as the Ahmadis of Pakistan. Members of these minorities are not only persecuted by governments, but are also frequently attacked and martyred by mobs unfettered by legal restrictions. So there is a kind of a mission on the part of the government to stop Orthodox Muslim to persecute Muslim minorities. Okay, so that's the conflict between Sharia and human rights as it is, as An-Naim sees it. The kind of irreducible conflict between human rights and Sharia as it is practiced today. He then goes on to, in part 3 of his book, to talk about what he calls the politics and sociology of Islamization. From a strictly philosophical point of view, this is not something we want to spend too much time on, because, as I said, what he does is pretty much to explain the dynamics of this not uniform process, actually a process characterized by ups and downs in the level of Islamization of each society. It's not a uniform development, because we cannot say that Islamic states have gone gradually, perhaps slowly, towards a process of secularization. It's more really going up and down depending on political circumstances. For example, the supposedly secular socialist regime of Ali Bhutto in Pakistan was the first substantially advanced the cause of Islamization in Pakistan's history. On the other hand, General Suharto in Indonesia, who came to power to counter a communist coup d'etat in 1965, has proven to be the most resistant to Islamization in that country. So each situation has its own internal logic, and what we have to understand is that the logic is often dictated by the needs of the elites in power to strengthen their rule. I mean, they really use religion as an instrument of power, instrumentum regni, as the modern European philosopher would put it. Religion is a way that you use to make your rule stronger, especially if it's not that strong at the specific moment, except that, and this is the other part of An-Naim's analysis, except that when you start flirting with Islamic fundamentalists, you never know how it ends, because they can, overthrow you, and they can really establish a fundamentalist state. To a certain extent, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt followed that kind of trajectory, right? I mean, it was kind of, what was his name, the former president of Egypt? Well, it escapes me now, but there was this president who had been ruling Egypt for the last 30 years, who was flirting